Almost 2 years after the world rallied behind Ukraine for the cause of protecting the rules-based international order, the biggest threat to that order has emerged. Before we get into it, we need to understand how the rules-based order works. The international community is made up of 193 UN member states. Governing all these states is the UN Charter and hundreds of international treaties such as the Geneva Conventions, Vienna Convention and the Genocide Convention. At the heart of this process sits the International Court of Justice. Headquartered at The Hague, Netherlands, the ICJ hears out disputes between different countries and issues binding verdicts based on international law. But the catch is that the ICJ does not have its own police force. Instead, the ICJ relies on its moral authority as a neutral arbiter of the law, with the assumption that once ICJ has had the final word on the matter, all countries will abide by it regardless of whether they agree with it or not. The countries that do not abide by the ICJ rulings shall be pressured and punished by all other countries. This assumption has held true for the most part. Countries have generally complied with the ICJ rulings, and those who have not have faced sanctions, diplomatic isolation and in some cases even military interventions. This is what Russia faced when it kept up its war in Ukraine despite ICJ rulings to halt it. It led to blocking of Russian banks from global finances, triggered capital flight from the country and caused a 4.5% contraction in GDP. The system isn't perfect. Sometimes countries do get away with violating ICJ rulings. But it still offers a far better alternative to dispute resolution than simply measuring which of the two parties have a bigger red button. Unfortunately, this system is now at the brink of collapse. In December 2023, South Africa sued Israel for violating Genocide Convention during the war in Gaza. After hearing the preliminary arguments of both sides at The Hague, the ICJ concluded that South Africa has a plausible case which can proceed to trial. As the litigation will take years, the court also issued an interim order asking Israel to take actions to prevent genocide, punish incitement to genocide, and increase humanitarian aid to the civilian population. In response to the 86-page ruling of the ICJ, Israel's Minister for National Security responded, Hague Schmeig. This was essentially an echo of the Israeli Prime Minister's statement from before the order, when he explicitly said that The Hague will not stop him. Contrary to the ICJ ruling to increase the supply of aid to Gaza, the very next day Israel went on a smear campaign against the United Nations Relief Works Agency, accusing 12 of its 30,000 workers of being involved in militant activity. At the time of making this video, that number has been revised down to 4. One would expect global condemnations against a government that is so open in its defiance of international law. Quite the opposite happened. Without any investigation, over a dozen countries including the United States, Canada, Australia and Germany sided with Israel and halted funding to the relief agency, making themselves not just supporters of Israel in the lawsuit, but potentially implicating themselves in anything Israel gets convicted of. Since enforcement of ICJ verdicts relies on countries voluntarily coming together to punish its violations, the world's major power centers siding with Israel makes that goal near impossible. But it might prove to be a short-sighted move. Today it is the United States protecting its allies from the ICJ verdicts. But if the idea of cherry-picking which verdicts get enforced is normalized, it can very easily be applied against the United States too. China, for instance, being the largest trading partner for 120 out of 193 UN countries, might find it easy to convince many of them to flout any ICJ rulings that hurt Chinese interests or those of its allies. This will eventually escalate into complete sidelining of the International Court from the global dispute resolution processes and bring the world back to the era where countries bought or fought their way to victory. The only way to prevent this from happening is for us citizens of the world to pressure our respective governments to uphold the international law, even when it is inconvenient.